Chapter 24 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 24. The morning of the confirmation was come. It was mid-May time, bringing with it weather not perhaps quite so blooming as that assumed to be natural to the month by the joyous poets of 300 years ago, but a very tolerable, well-wearing May, that the average rustic would willingly have compounded for, in lieu of Mays occasionally fairer, but usually more foul. Among the larger shrubs and flowers which composed the outworks of the Welland gardens, the lilac, the laburnum, and the guelder rose hung out their respective colours of purple, yellow, and white, whilst within these, belted round from every disturbing gale, rose the columbine, the peony, the larkspur, and the Solomon's seal. The animate things that moved amid this scene of colour were plodding bees, gadding butterflies, and numerous sauntering young feminine candidates for the impending confirmation, who, having gaily bedecked themselves for the ceremony, were enjoying their own appearance by walking about in twos and threes till it was time to start. Swithin St. Cleeve, whose preparations were somewhat simpler than those of the village belles, waited till his grandmother and Hannah had set out, and then, locking the door, followed towards the distant church. On reaching the churchyard gate he met Mr. Torkingham, who shook hands with him in the manner of a man with several irons in the fire, and, telling Swithin where to sit, disappeared to hunt up some candidates who had not yet made themselves visible. Casting his eyes round for Viviette, and seeing nothing of her, Swithin went on to the church porch and looked in. From the north side of the nave smiled a host of girls, gaily uniform in dress, age, and a temporary repression of their natural tendency to skip like a hare over the meshes of good counsel. Their white muslin dresses, their round white caps, from beneath whose borders dark knots and curls of various shades of brown escaped upon their low shoulders, as if against their will, lighted up the dark pews and grey stonework to an unwonted warmth and life. On the south side were the young men and boys, heavy, angular, and massive, as indeed was rather necessary, considering what they would have to bear at the hands of wind and weather before they returned to that mouldy nave for the last time. Over the heads of all these he could see into the chancel, to the square pew on the north side, which was attached to Welland House. There he discerned Lady Constantine, already arrived, her brother Louis sitting by her side. Swithin entered and seated himself at the end of a bench, and she, who had been on the watch, at once showed by subtle signs her consciousness of the presence of the young man who had reversed the ordained sequence of the church services on her account. She appeared in black attire, though not strictly in mourning, a touch of red in her bonnet setting off the richness of her complexion without making her gay. Handsomest woman in the church she decidedly was, and yet a disinterested spectator who had known all the circumstances would probably have felt that, the future considered, Swithin's more natural mate would have been one of the muslin-clad maidens who were to be presented to the bishop with him that day. When the bishop had arrived and gone into the chancel, and blown his nose, the congregation were sufficiently impressed by his presence to leave off looking at one another. The Right Reverend Cuthbert Helmsdale, D.D., 94th occupant of the episcopal throne of the diocese, revealed himself to be a personage of dark complexion, whose darkness was thrown still further into prominence by the lawn protuberances that now rose upon his two shoulders, like the eastern and western hemispheres. In stature he seemed to be tall and imposing, but something of this aspect may have been derived from his robes. The service was, as usual, of a length which severely tried the tarrying powers of the young people assembled, and it was not till the youth of all the other parishes had gone up that the turn came for the Welland bevy. Swithin and some older ones were nearly the last. When, at the heels of Mr. Torkingham, he passed Lady Constantine's pew, he lifted his eyes from the red lining of that gentleman's hood sufficiently high to catch hers. She was abstracted, tearful, regarding him with all the rapt mingling of religion, love, fervour, and hope which such women can feel at such times, and which men know nothing of. How fervidly she watched the bishop place his hand on her beloved youth's head! How she saw the great episcopal ring glistening in the sun among Swithin's brown curls! How she waited to hear if Dr. Helmsdale uttered the form, "this thy child," which he used for the younger ones, or this thy servant, which he used for those older? And how, when he said, this thy child, she felt a prick of conscience, like a person who had entrapped an innocent youth into marriage for her own gratification, till she remembered that she had raised his social position thereby, and this could only have been told in its entirety by herself. As for Swithin, he felt ashamed of his own utter lack of the high enthusiasm which beamed so eloquently from her eyes. When he passed her again on the return journey from the Bishop to his seat, her face was warm with a blush which her brother might have observed had he regarded her. Whether he had observed or not, as soon as Swithin St. Cleeve had sat himself down again, Louis Glanville turned and looked hard at the young astronomer. It was the first time that St. Cleeve and Viviette's brother had been face to face in a distinct light, their first meeting having occurred in the dusk of a railway station. Swithin was not in the habit of noticing people's features. He scarcely ever observed any detail of physiognomy in his friends, a generalization from their whole aspect forming his idea of them. And he now only noted a young man of perhaps 30, who lolled a good deal, and in whose small dark eyes seemed to be concentrated the activity that the rest of his frame decidedly lacked. This gentleman's eyes were henceforward, to the end of the service, continually fixed upon Swithin, but as this was their natural direction from the position of his seat, there was no great strangeness in the circumstance. Swithin wanted to say to Viviette, "Now, I hope you are pleased. I have conformed to your ideas of my duty, leaving my fitness out of consideration." But as he could only see her bonnet and forehead, it was not possible even to look the intelligence. He turned to his left hand, where the organ stood, with Miss Tabitha Lark seated behind it. It being now sermon time, the youthful blower had fallen asleep over the handle of his bellows, and Tabitha pulled out her handkerchief, intending to flap him awake with it. With the handkerchief tumbled out a whole family of unexpected articles: a silver thimble, a photograph, a little purse, a scent bottle, some loose halfpence, 9 green gooseberries, and a key. They rolled to Swithin's feet, and passively obeying his first instinct, he picked up as many of the articles as he could find, and handed them to her amid the smiles of the neighbours. Tabitha was half dead with humiliation at such an event happening under the very eyes of the Bishop on this glorious occasion. She turned pale as a sheet, and could hardly keep her seat. Fearing she might faint, Swithin, who had genuinely sympathized, bent over and whispered encouragingly, "Don't mind it, Tabitha. Shall I take you out into the air?" She declined his offer, and presently the sermon came to an end. Swithin lingered behind the rest of the congregation sufficiently long to see Lady Constantine, accompanied by her brother, the bishop's chaplain, Mr. Torkingham, and several other clergy and ladies, enter to the grand luncheon by the door which admitted from the churchyard to the lawn of Welland House, the whole group talking with a vivacity all the more intense, as it seemed, from the recent 2 hours' enforced repression of their social qualities within the adjoining building. The young man stood till he was left quite alone in the churchyard, and then went slowly homeward over the hill, perhaps a trifle depressed at the impossibility of being near Viviette in this her one day of gaiety, and joining the conversation of those who surrounded her. Not that he felt much jealousy of her situation, as his wife, in comparison with his own. He had so clearly understood from the beginning that in the event of marriage their outward lives were to run on as before, that to rebel now would have been unmanly in himself and cruel to her, by adding to embarrassments that were great enough already. His momentary doubt was of his own strength to achieve sufficiently high things to render him, in relation to her, other than a patronized young favourite, whom she had married at an immense sacrifice of position. Now, at 20, he was doomed to isolation even from a wife. Could it be that at, say, 30, he would be welcomed everywhere? But with motion through the sun and air his mood assumed a lighter complexion, and on reaching home he remembered with interest that Venus was in a favourable aspect for observation that afternoon. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 25. Meanwhile, the interior of Welland House was rattling with the progress of the ecclesiastical luncheon. The bishop, who sat at Lady Constantine's side, seemed enchanted with her company, and from the beginning she engrossed his attention almost entirely. The truth was that the circumstance of her not having her whole soul centred on the success of the repast and the pleasure of Bishop Helmsdale imparted to her in a great measure the mood to ensure both. Her brother Louis it was who had laid out the plan of entertaining the Bishop, to which she had assented but indifferently. She was secretly bound to another, on whose career she had staked all her happiness. Having thus other interests, she evinced today the ease of one who hazards nothing, and there was no sign of that preoccupation with housewifely contingencies which so often makes the hostess hardly recognizable as the charming woman who graced a friend's home the day before. In marrying Swithin, Lady Constantine had played her card, recklessly, impulsively, ruinously perhaps, but she had played it. It could not be withdrawn, and she took this morning's luncheon as an episode that could result in nothing to her beyond the day's entertainment. Hence, by that power of indirectness, to accomplish in an hour what strenuous aiming will not effect in a lifetime, she fascinated the Bishop to an unprecedented degree. A bachelor, he rejoiced in the commanding period of life that stretches between the time of waning impulse and the time of incipient dotage, when a woman can reach the male heart neither by awakening a young man's passion nor an old man's infatuation. He must be made to admire, or he can be made to do nothing. Unintentionally, that is how Viviette operated on her guest. Lady Constantine, to external view, was in a position to desire many things, and of a sort to desire them. She was obviously by nature impulsive to indiscretion, but instead of exhibiting activities to correspond, recently gratified affection lent to her manner just now a sweet serenity, a truly Christian contentment, which it puzzled the learned Bishop exceedingly to find in a warm young widow, and increased his interest in her every moment. Thus matters stood when the conversation veered round to the morning's confirmation. "That was a singularly engaging young man who came up among Mr. Torkingham's candidates," said the Bishop to her somewhat abruptly. But abruptness does not catch a woman without her wit. "Which one?" she said innocently. "That youth with the corn-coloured hair, as a poet of the new school would call it, who sat just at the side of the organ. Do you know who he is?" In answering, Viviette showed a little nervousness for the first time that day. "Oh yes, he is the son of an unfortunate gentleman who was formerly curate here, a Mr. St. Cleeve." "I never saw a handsomer young man in my life," said the Bishop. Lady Constantine blushed. There was a lack of self-consciousness, too, in his manner of presenting himself, which very much won me. "A Mr. St. Cleeve, you say? A curate's son? His father must have been St. Cleeve of all angels, whom I knew. How comes he to be staying on here? What is he doing?" Mr. Torkingham, who kept one ear on the Bishop all the lunch-time, finding that Lady Constantine was not ready with an answer, hastened to reply. "Your lordship is right. His father was an all-angels man. The youth is rather to be pitied." "He was a man of fine talent," affirmed the Bishop, "but I quite lost sight of him." "He was a curate to the late vicar," resumed the parson, "and was much liked by the parish; but being erratic in his tastes and tendencies, he rashly contracted a marriage with the daughter of a farmer, and then quarrelled with the local gentry for not taking up his wife. This lad was an only child. There was enough money to educate him, and he is sufficiently well provided for to be independent of the world so long as he is content to live here with great economy. But of course this gives him few opportunities of bettering himself." "Yes, naturally," replied the Bishop of Melchester. "Better have been left entirely dependent on himself. These half incomes do men little good, unless they happen to be either weaklings or geniuses." Lady Constantine would have given the world to say, "He is a genius, and the hope of my life," but it would have been decidedly risky, and in another moment was unnecessary, for Mr. Torkingham said, "There is a certain genius in the young man, I sometimes think." "Well, he really looks quite out of the common," said the Bishop. "Youthful genius is sometimes disappointing," observed Viviette, not believing it in the least. "Yes," said the Bishop, "though it depends, Lady Constantine, on what you understand by disappointing. It may produce nothing visible to the world's eye, and yet may complete its development within a very perfect degree. Objective achievements, though the only ones which are counted, are not the only ones that exist and have value, and I, for one, should be sorry to assert that, because a man of genius dies as unknown to the world as when he was born, he therefore was an instance of wasted material. Objective achievements were, however, those that Lady Constantine had a weakness for in the present case, and she asked her more experienced guest if he thought early development of a special talent a good sign in youth. The Bishop thought it well that a particular bent should not show itself too early, lest disgust should result. Still, argued Lady Constantine rather firmly, for she felt this opinion of the Bishop's to be one throwing doubt on Swithin, sustained fruition is compatible with early bias. Tycho Brahe showed quite a passion for the solar system when he was but a youth. So did Kepler, and James Ferguson had a surprising knowledge of the stars by the time he was 11 or 12. Yes, sustained fruition, conceded the Bishop, rather liking the words, is certainly compatible with early bias. Fenelon preached at 14. Mr. St. Cleeve, is not in the church, said Lady Constantine. He is a scientific young man, my lord, explained Mr. Torkingham. An astronomer, she added, with suppressed pride. An astronomer? Really, that makes him still more interesting than being handsome and the son of the man I knew. How and where does he study astronomy? He has a beautiful observatory. He has made use of an old column that was erected on this manor to the memory of one of the Constantines. It has been very ingeniously adapted for his purpose, and he does very good work there. I believe he occasionally sends up a paper to the Royal Society, or Greenwich, or somewhere, and to astronomical periodicals. I should have had no idea, from his boyish look, that he had advanced so far, the Bishop answered, and yet I saw on his face that within there was a book worth studying. His is a career I should very much like to watch. A thrill of pleasure chased through Lady Constantine's heart at this praise of her chosen one. It was an unwitting compliment to her taste and discernment in singling him out for her own, despite its temporary inexpediency. Her brother Louis now spoke. I fancy he is as interested in one of his fellow creatures as in the science of astronomy, observed the cynic dryly. In whom? Said Lady Constantine quickly. In the fair maiden who sat at the organ, a pretty girl rather. I noticed a sort of by-play going on between them occasionally, during the sermon, which meant mating, if I am not mistaken. She, said Lady Constantine, she is only a village girl, a dairyman's daughter, Tabitha Lark, who used to come and read to me. She may be a savage for all that I know, but there is something between those two young people nevertheless. The Bishop looked as if he had allowed his interest in a stranger to carry him too far, and Mr. Torkingham was horrified at the irreverent and easy familiarity of Louis Glanville's talk in the presence of a consecrated bishop. As for Viviette, her tongue lost all its volubility. She felt quite faint at heart, and hardly knew how to control herself. I have never noticed anything of the sort, said Mr. Torkingham. It would be a matter for regret, said the Bishop, if he should follow his father in forming an attachment that would be a hindrance to him in any honourable career, though perhaps an early marriage, intrinsically considered, would not be bad for him. A youth who looks as if he had come straight from old Greece may be exposed to many temptations, should he go out into the world without a friend or counsellor to guide him. Despite her sudden jealousy, Viviette's eyes grew moist at the picture of her innocent Swithin going into the world without a friend or counsellor. But she was sick in soul and disquieted by Louis's dreadful remarks, who, unbeliever as he was in human virtue, could have no reason whatever for representing Swithin as engaged in a private love affair, if such were not his honest impression. She was so absorbed during the remainder of the luncheon that she did not even observe the kindly light that her presence was shedding on the right reverend ecclesiastic by her side. He reflected it back in tones duly mellowed by his position. The minor clergy caught up the rays thereof, and so the gentle influence played down the table. The company soon departed when the luncheon was over, and the remainder of the day passed in quietness, the Bishop being occupied in his room at the vicarage in writing letters or a sermon. Having a long journey before him next day, he had expressed a wish to be housed for the night without ceremony, and would have dined alone with Mr. Torkingham, but that, by a happy thought, Lady Constantine and her brother were asked to join them. However, when Louis crossed the churchyard and entered the vicarage drawing room at 7 o'clock, his sister was not in his company. She was, he said, suffering from a slight headache, and much regretted that she was on that account unable to come. At this intelligence, the social sparkle disappeared from the Bishop's eye, and he sat down to table, endeavouring to mould into the form of episcopal serenity an expression which was really one of common human disappointment. In this simple statement Louis Glanville had by no means expressed all the circumstances which accompanied his sister's refusal, at the last moment, to dine at her neighbour's house. Louis had strongly urged her to bear up against her slight indisposition, if it were that and not disinclination, and come along with him on just this one occasion, perhaps a more important episode in her life than she was aware of. Viviette thereupon knew quite well that he alluded to the favourable impression she was producing on the Bishop, notwithstanding that neither of them mentioned the Bishop's name. But she did not give way, though the argument waxed strong between them, and Louis left her in no very amiable mood, saying, "I don't believe you have any more headache than I have, Viviette. It is some provoking whim of yours, nothing more." In this there was a substratum of truth. When her brother had left her, and she had seen him from the window entering the vicarage gate, Viviette seemed to be much relieved, and sat down in her bedroom till the evening grew dark, and only the light shining through the trees from the parsonage dining room revealed to the eye where that dwelling stood. Then she arose, and putting on the cloak she had used so many times before for the same purpose, she locked her bedroom door, to be supposed within in case of the accidental approach of a servant, and let herself privately out of the house. Lady Constantine paused for a moment under the vicarage windows, till she could sufficiently well hear the voices of the diners to be sure that they were actually within, and then went on her way, which was towards the Rings Hill column. She appeared a mere spot, hardly distinguishable from the grass, as she crossed the open ground, and soon became absorbed in the black mass of the fir plantation. Meanwhile, the conversation at Mr. Torkingham's dinner table was not of a highly exhilarating quality. The parson, in long self-communing during the afternoon, had decided that the diocesan synod, whose annual session at Melchester had occurred in the month previous, would afford a solid and unimpeachable subject to launch during the meal, whenever conversation flagged, and that it would be one likely to win the respect of his spiritual chieftain for himself as the introducer. Accordingly, in the further belief that she could not have too much of a good thing, Mr. Torkingham not only acted upon his idea, but at every pause rallied to the synod point with unbroken firmness. Everything which had been discussed at that last session, such as the introduction of the lay element into the councils of the church, the reconstitution of the ecclesiastical courts, church patronage, the tithe question, was revived by Mr. Torkingham, and the excellent remarks which the Bishop had made in his addresses on those subjects were quoted back to him. As for Bishop Helmsdale himself, his instinct seemed to be to allude in a debonair spirit to the incidents of the past day, to the flowers in Lady Constantine's bed, the date of her house, perhaps with a view of hearing a little more about their owner from Louis, who would very readily have followed the Bishop's lead had the parson allowed him room. But this Mr. Torkingham seldom did, and about 9:30 they prepared to separate. Louis Glanville had risen from the table, and was standing by the window, looking out upon the sky and privately yawning, the topics discussed having been hardly in his line. "A fine night," he said at last. "I suppose our young astronomer is hard at work now?" said the Bishop, following the direction of Louis's glance towards the clear sky. "Yes," said the parson. "He is very assiduous when the nights are good for observation. I have occasionally joined him in his tower, and looked through his telescope with great benefit to my ideas of celestial phenomena. I have not seen what he is doing lately." "Suppose we stroll that way?" said Louis. "Would you be interested in seeing the observatory, Bishop?" "I am quite willing to go," said the Bishop, "if the distance is not too great. I should not at all be averse to making the acquaintance of so exceptional a young man as this Mr. St. Cleeve seems to be, and I have never seen the inside of an observatory in my life." The intention was no sooner formed than it was carried out, Mr. Torkingham leading the way. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 26. Half an hour before this time, Swithin St. Cleeve had been sitting in his cabin at the base of the column, working out some figures from observations taken on preceding nights, with a view to a theory that he had in his head on the motions of certain so-called fixed stars. The evening being a little chilly, a small fire was burning in the stove, and this and the shaded lamp before him lent a remarkably cosy air to the chamber. He was awakened from his reveries by a scratching at the window pane, like that of the point of an ivy leaf, which he knew to be really caused by the tip of his sweetheart wife's forefinger. He rose and opened the door to admit her, not without astonishment as to how she had been able to get away from her friends. "Dearest Viv, why, what's the matter?" he said, perceiving that her face as the lamplight fell on it was sad, and even stormy. "I thought I would run across to see you. I have heard something so to your discredit, and I know it can't be true. I know you are constancy itself, but your constancy produces strange effects in people's eyes." "Good heavens! Nobody has found us out?" No, it's not that. You know, Swithin, that I am always sincere, and willing to own if I am to blame in anything. Now will you prove to me that you are the same by owning some fault to me?" "Yes, dear, indeed. Directly I can think of one worth owning." "I wonder one does not rush upon your tongue in a moment." "I confess that I am sufficiently a Pharisee not to experience that spontaneity." "Swithin, don't speak so affectedly, when you know well what I mean. Is it nothing to you that, after all your vows for life, you have thought it right to flirt with a village girl?" "Oh, Viviette," interrupted Swithin, taking her hand, which was hot and trembling. "You who are full of noble and generous feelings, and regard me with devoted tenderness that has never been surpassed by woman, how can you be so greatly at fault? I flirt, Viviette! By thinking that, you injure yourself in my eyes. Why, I am so far from doing so that I continually pull myself up for watching you too jealously, as today, when I have been dreading the effect upon you of other company in my absence, and thinking that you rather shut the gates against me when you have big wigs to entertain." "Do you, Swithin?" she cried. It was evident that the honest tone of his words was having a great effect in clearing away the clouds. She added with an uncertain smile, "But how can I believe that, after what was seen today? My brother, not knowing in the least that I had an iota of interest in you, told me that he witnessed the signs of an attachment between you and Tabitha Lark in the church this morning." "Ah!" cried Swithin with a burst of laughter. "Now I know what you mean, and what has caused this misunderstanding. How good of you, Viviette, to come to me at once to have it out with me, instead of brooding over it with dark imaginings, and thinking bitter things of me, as many women would have done." He succinctly told the story of his little adventure with Tabitha that morning, and the sky was clear on both sides. "When shall I be able to claim you?" he added, "and put an end to all such painful accidents as these?" She partially sighed. Her perception of what the outside world was made of, latterly somewhat obscured by solitude and her lover's company, had been revived today by her entertainment of the bishop, clergyman, and more particularly clergymen's wives; and it did not diminish her sense of the difficulties in Swithin's path, to see anew how little was thought of the greatest gifts, mental and spiritual, if they were not backed up by substantial temporalities. However, the pair made the best of their future that circumstances permitted, and the interview was at length drawing to a close when there came, without the slightest forewarning, a smart rat-tat-tat upon the door. "Oh, I am lost!" said Viviette, seizing his arm. "Why was I so incautious?" "It's nobody of consequence," whispered Swithin assuringly. "Somebody from my grandmother, probably, to know when I am coming home." They were unperceived so far, for the only window which gave light to the hut was screened by a curtain. At that moment they heard the sound of their visitors' voices, and with a consternation as great as her own, Swithin discerned the tones of Mr. Torkingham and the Bishop of Melchester. "Oh, where shall I get? What shall I do?" said the poor lady, clasping her hands. Swithin looked around the cabin, and a very little look was required to take in all its resources. At one end, as previously explained, were a table, stove, chair, cupboard, and so on, while the other was completely occupied by a diminutive Arabian bedstead, hung with curtains of pink and white chintz. On one side of the bed there was a narrow channel about a foot wide between it and the wall of the hut. Into this cramped retreat Viviette slid herself, and stood trembling behind the curtains. By this time the knock had been repeated more loudly, the light through the window blind unhappily revealing the presence of some inmate. Swithin threw open the door, and Mr. Torkingham introduced his visitors. The Bishop shook hands with the young man, told him he had known his father, and at Swithin's invitation, weak as it was, entered the cabin, the vicar and Louis Glanville remaining on the threshold, not to inconveniently crowd the limited space within. Bishop Hemsdale looked benignantly around the apartment, and said, "Quite a settlement in the backwoods, quite. Far enough from the world to afford the votary of science the seclusion he needs, and not so far as to limit his resources. The hermit may apparently live here in as much solitude as in a primeval forest." "His lordship has been good enough to express an interest in your studies," said Mr. Torkingham to St. Cleeve, "and we have come to ask you to let us see the observatory." "With great pleasure," stammered Swithin. "Where is the observatory?" inquired the Bishop, peering around again. "The staircase is just outside this door," Swithin answered. "I am at your lordship's service, and will show you up at once." "And this is your little bed, for use when you work late?" said the Bishop. "Yes, I'm afraid it's rather untidy," Swithin apologized. "And here are your books," the Bishop continued, turning to the table and the shaded lamp. "You take an observation at the top, I presume, and come down here to record your observations." The young man explained his precise process as well as his state of mind would let him, and while he was doing so Mr. Torkingham and Louis waited patiently without, looking sometimes into the night and sometimes through the door at the interlocutors, and listening to their scientific converse. When all had been exhibited here below, Swithin lit his lantern, and inviting his visitors to follow, led the way up the column, experienced no small sense of relief as soon as he heard the footsteps of all three tramping on the stairs behind him. He knew very well that, once they were inside the spiral, Viviette was out of danger, her knowledge of the locality enabling her to find her way with perfect safety through the plantation and into the park home. At the top he uncovered his equatorial, and for the first time at ease explained to them its beauties, and revealed by its help the glories of those stars that were eligible for inspection. The Bishop spoke as intelligently as could be expected on a topic not particularly his own, but somehow he seemed rather more abstracted in manner now than when he had arrived. Swithin thought that perhaps the long clamber up the stairs, coming after a hard day's work, had taken his spontaneity out of him, and Mr. Torkingham was afraid that his lordship was getting bored. But this did not appear to be the case, for though he said little, he stayed on some time longer, examining the construction of the dome after relinquishing the telescope, while occasionally Swithin caught the eyes of the Bishop fixed hard on him. "Perhaps he sees some likeness of my father in me," the young man thought, and the party making ready to leave at this time, he conducted them to the bottom of the tower. Swithin was not prepared for what followed their descent. All were standing at the foot of the staircase. The astronomer, lantern in hand, offered to show them the way out of the plantation, to which Mr. Torkingham replied that he knew the way very well, and would not trouble his young friend. He strode forward with the words, and Louis followed him, after waiting a moment and finding that the Bishop would not take the precedence. The latter and Swithin were thus left together for one moment, whereupon the Bishop turned. "Mr. St. Cleeve," he said in a strange voice, "I would like to speak to you privately before I leave, tomorrow morning. Can you meet me, let me see, in the churchyard at 10:30? "Oh yes, my lord, certainly," said Swithin, and before he had recovered from his surprise the Bishop had joined the others in the shades of the plantation. Swithin immediately opened the door of the hut and scanned the nook behind the bed. As he had expected, his bird had flown. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 27. All night the astronomer's mind was on the stretch with curiosity as to what the Bishop could wish to say to him. A dozen conjectures entered his brain, to be abandoned in turn as unlikely. That which finally seemed the most plausible was that the Bishop, having some interest in his pursuits, and entertaining friendly recollections of his father, was going to ask if he could do anything to help him on in the profession he had chosen. Should this be the case, thought the suddenly sanguine youth, it would seem like an encouragement to that spirit of firmness which had led him to reject his late uncle's offer because it involved the renunciation of Lady Constantine. At last he fell asleep, and when he awoke it was so late that the hour was ready to solve what conjecture could not. After a hurried breakfast he paced across the fields, entering the churchyard by the south gate precisely at the appointed minute. The enclosure was well adapted for a private interview, being bounded by bushes of laurel and alder nearly on all sides. He looked round. The bishop was not there, nor any living creature save himself. Swithin sat down upon a tombstone to await Bishop Helmsdale's arrival. While he sat, he fancied he could hear voices in conversation not far off, and further attention convinced him that they came from Lady Constantine's lawn, which was divided from the churchyard by a high wall and shrubbery only. As the bishop still delayed his coming, though the time was nearly 11, and as the lady whose sweet voice mingled with those heard from the lawn was his personal property, Swithin became exceedingly curious to learn what was going on within that screened promenade. A way of doing this occurred to him. The key was in the church door. He opened it, entered, and descended to the ringer's loft in the west tower. At the back of this was a window commanding a full view of Viviette's garden front. The flowers were in their gayest bloom, and the creepers on the walls of the house were bursting into tufts of young green. A broad gravel walk ran from end to end of the façade, terminating in a large conservatory. In the walk were 3 people, pacing up and down. Lady Constantine's was the central figure, her brother being on one side of her, and on the other a stately form in a corded shovel hat of glossy beaver, and black breeches. This was the bishop. Viviette carried over her shoulder a sunshade lined with red, which she twirled idly. They were laughing and chatting gaily, and when the group approached the churchyard many of their remarks entered the silence of the church tower through the ventilator of the window. The conversation was general, yet interesting enough to Swithin. At length Louis stepped upon the grass and picked up something that had lain there, which turned out to be a bowl. Throwing it forward he took a second, and bowled it towards the first, or jack. The bishop, who seemed to be in a sprightly mood, followed suit, and bowled one in a curve towards the jack, turning and speaking to Lady Constantine as he concluded the feat. As she had not left the gravelled terrace, he raised his voice, so that the words reached Swithin distinctly. "Do you follow us?" he asked gaily. "I am not skilful," she said. "I always bowl narrow." The bishop meditatively paused. "This moment reminds one of the scene in Richard II," he said. "I mean the Duke of York's garden, where the Queen and her 2 ladies play, and the Queen says, 'What sport shall we devise here in this garden, to drive away the heavy thought of care?' To which her lady answers, 'Madam, we'll play at bowls.'" "That's an unfortunate quotation for you," said Lady Constantine. "For if I don't forget, the Queen declined, saying, ''Twill make me think the world is full of rubs, and that my fortune runs against the bias.'" "Then I cite mal à propos. But it is an interesting old game, and might have been played at that very date on this very green." The bishop lazily bowled another, and while he was doing it, Viviette's glance rose by accident to the church tower window, where she recognized Swithin's face. Her surprise was only momentary, and waiting till both her companions' backs were turned, she smiled and blew him a kiss. In another minute she had another opportunity, and blew him another, afterwards blowing him one a 3rd time. Her blowings were put a stop to by the bishop and Louis throwing down the bowls and rejoining her in the path, the house clock at that moment striking 11:30. "This is a fine way of keeping an engagement," said Swithin to himself. "I've waited an hour while you indulge in those trifles." He fumed, turned, and beheld somebody at his elbow, Tabitha Lark. Swithin started and said, "How did you come here, Tabitha?" "In the course of my calling, Mr. St. Cleeve," said the smiling girl. "I come to practice the organ. When I entered I saw you up here through the tower arch, and I crept to see what you were looking at. The bishop is a striking man, is he not?" "Yes, rather," said Swithin. "I think he is much devoted to Lady Constantine, and I'm glad of it, aren't you?' 'Oh yes, very,' said Swithin, wondering if Tabitha had seen the tender little salutes between Lady Constantine and himself. 'I don't think she cares much for him,' added Tabitha judiciously. 'Or even if she does, she could be got away from him in no time by a younger man.' 'Pooh, that's nothing,' said Swithin impatiently. Tabitha then remarked that her blower had not come to time, and that she must go to look for him, upon which she descended the stairs and left Swithin again alone. A few minutes later the Bishop suddenly looked at his watch, Lady Constantine having withdrawn towards the house. Apparently apologizing to Louis, the Bishop came down the terrace and through the door into the churchyard. Swithin hastened downstairs and joined him in the path under the sunny wall of the aisle. Their glances met, and it was with some consternation that Swithin beheld the change that a few short minutes had wrought on that episcopal countenance. On the lawn with Lady Constantine, the rays of an almost perpetual smile had brightened his dark aspect like flowers in a shady place. Now the smile was gone as completely as yesterday. The lines of his face were firm. His dark eyes and whiskers were overspread with gravity, and as he gazed upon Swithin from the repose of his stable figure, it was like an evangelized King of Spades come to have it out with the Knave of Hearts. To return for a moment to Louis Glanville. He had been somewhat struck with the abruptness of the Bishop's departure, and more particularly by the circumstance that he had gone away by the private door into the churchyard, instead of by the regular exit on the other side. True, great men were known to suffer from absence of mind, and Bishop Helmsdale, having a dim sense that he had entered by that door yesterday, might have unconsciously turned thitherward now. Louis, upon the whole, thought little of the matter, and being now left quite alone on the lawn, he seated himself in an arbour and began smoking. The arbour was situated against the churchyard wall. The atmosphere was as still as the air of a hothouse. Only 14 inches of brickwork divided Louis from the scene of the Bishop's interview with St. Cleeve, and as voices on the lawn had been audible to Swithin in the churchyard, voices in the churchyard could be heard without difficulty from that close corner of the lawn. No sooner had Louis lit a cigar than the dialogue began. 'Ah, there you are, St. Cleeve,' said the Bishop, hardly replying to Swithin's good morning. 'I fear I am a little late. Well, my request to you to meet me may have seemed somewhat unusual, seeing that we were strangers till a few hours ago.' 'I don't mind that, if your lordship wishes to see me.' 'I thought it best to see you regarding your confirmation yesterday, and my reason for taking a more active step with you than I should otherwise have done is that I have some interest in you, through having known your father when we were undergraduates. His rooms were on the same staircase as mine at All Angels, and we were friendly till time and affairs separated us even more completely than usually happens. However, about your presenting yourself for confirmation.' The Bishop's voice grew stern. 'If I had known yesterday morning what I knew 12 hours later, I wouldn't have confirmed you at all.' 'Indeed, my lord?' 'Yes, I say it, and I mean it. I visited your observatory last night.' 'You did, my lord?' 'In inspecting it I noticed something which I may truly describe as extraordinary. I have had young men present themselves to me who turned out to be notoriously unfit, either from giddiness, from being profane or intemperate, or from some bad quality or other, but I never remember a case which equalled the cool culpability of this. While infringing the first principles of social decorum, you might at least have respected the ordinance sufficiently to have stayed away from it altogether. Now I have sent for you here to see if a last entreaty and a direct appeal to your sense of manly uprightness will have any effect in inducing you to change your course of life.' The voice of Swithin in his next remark showed how tremendously this attack of the Bishop had told upon his feelings. Louis, of course, did not know the reason why the words should have affected him precisely as they did. To anyone in the secret, the double embarrassment arising from misapprehended ethics and inability to set matters right, because his word of secrecy to another was inviolable, would have accounted for the young man's emotions sufficiently well. 'I am very sorry your lordship should have seen anything objectionable,' said Swithin. 'May I ask what it was?' 'You know what it was. Something in your chamber, which forced me to the above conclusions. I disguised my feelings of sorrow at the time, for obvious reasons, but I never in my whole life was so shocked.' 'At what, my lord?' 'At what I saw.'
Pardon me, Bishop Helmsdale, but you said just now that we were strangers, so what you saw in my cabin concerns me only.' 'There I contradict you. 24 hours ago that remark would have been plausible enough, but by presenting yourself for confirmation at my hands you have invited my investigation into your principles.'
Swithin sighed. 'I admit it,' he said.
'And what do I find them?'
'You say reprehensible, but you might at least let me hear the proof.'
'I can do more, sir. I can let you see it.'
There was a pause. Louis Glanville was so highly interested that he stood upon the seat of the arbour and looked through the leafage over the wall. The Bishop had produced an article from his pocket.
'What is it?'
said Swithin, laboriously scrutinizing the thing.
'Why, don't you see?'
said the Bishop, holding it out between his finger and his thumb in Swithin's face.
'A bracelet. A coral bracelet. I found the wanton object on the bed in your cabin. And of the sex of the owner there can be no doubt. More than that, she was concealed behind the curtains, for I saw them move.'
In the decision of his opinion, the Bishop threw the coral bracelet down on the tombstone. 'Nobody was in my room, my lord, who had not a perfect right to be there,' said the younger man.
'Well, well, that's a matter of assertion. Now don't get into a passion, and say to me in your haste what you will repent of saying afterwards.'
'I am not in a passion, I assure your lordship. I am too sad for passion.'
'Very well. That's a hopeful sign. Now I would ask you, as one man of another, do you think that to come to me, the bishop of this large and important diocese, as you came yesterday, and pretend to be something that you are not, is quite upright conduct, leave alone religious? Think it over. We may never meet again, but bear in mind what your bishop and spiritual head says to you, and see if you cannot mend before it is too late.'
Swithin was as meek as Moses, but he tried to appear sturdy. 'My lord, I am in a difficult position,' he said mournfully. 'How difficult nobody but myself can tell. I cannot explain. There are insuperable reasons against it. But will you take my word of assurance that I am not as bad as I seem? Some day I will prove it. Till then I only ask that you suspend your judgment on me.' The Bishop shook his head incredulously and went towards the vicarage, as if he had lost his hearing. Swithin followed him with his eyes, and Louis followed the direction of Swithin's. Before the Bishop had reached the vicarage entrance, Lady Constantine crossed in front of him. She had a basket on her arm, and was in fact going to visit some of the poorer cottages. Who could believe the Bishop now to be the same man that he had been a moment before? The darkness left his face as if he had come out of a cave. His look was all sweetness and shine and gaiety as he again greeted Viviette. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 28. The conversation which arose between the Bishop and Lady Constantine was of that lively and reproductive kind which cannot be ended during any reasonable halt of two people going in opposite directions. He turned and walked with her along the laurel-screened lane that bordered the churchyard, till their voices died away in the distance. Swithin then aroused himself from his thoughtful regard of them, and went out of the churchyard by another gate. Seeing himself now to be alone on the scene, Louis Glanville descended from his post of observation in the arbour. He came through the private doorway, and on to that spot among the graves where the Bishop and St. Cleeve had conversed. On the tombstone still lay the coral bracelet which Dr. Helmsdale had flung down there in his indignation, for the agitated, introspective mood into which Swithin had been thrown had banished from his mind all thought of securing the trinket and putting it in his pocket. Louis picked up the little red scandal-breeding thing, and while walking on with it in his hand he observed Tabitha Lark approaching the church, in company with the young blower whom she had gone in search of to inspire her organ-practising within. Louis immediately put together, with that rare diplomatic keenness of which he was proud, the little scene he had witnessed between Tabitha and Swithin during the confirmation, and the Bishop's stern statement as to where he had found the bracelet. He had no longer any doubt that it belonged to her. "Poor girl," he said to himself, and sang in an undertone, "Tra de ri de ra, l'histoire n'est pas nouvelle." When she drew nearer, Louis called her by name. She sent the boy into the church and came forward, blushing at having been called by so fine a gentleman. Louis held out the bracelet. "Here's something I have found, or somebody else has found," he said to her. "I won't state where. Put it away, and say no more about it. I will not mention it either. Now go on into the church where you are going, and may Heaven have mercy on your soul, my dear." "Thank you, sir," said Tabitha with some perplexity, yet inclined to be pleased, and only recognizing in the situation the fact that Lady Constantine's humorous brother was making her a present. "You are much obliged to me?" "Oh, yes." "Well, Miss Lark, I have discovered a secret, you see." "What may that be, Mr. Glanville?" "That you are in love." "I don't admit it, sir. Who told you so?" "Nobody. Only I put two and two together. Now take my advice. Beware of lovers. They're a bad lot, and bring young women to tears." "Some do, I dare say, but some don't." "And you think that in your particular case the latter alternative will hold good? We generally think that we should be lucky ourselves, though all the world before us, in the same situation, have been otherwise." "Oh yes, or we should die outright of despair." "Well, I don't think you will be lucky in your case." "Please, how do you know so much, since my case has not yet arrived?" asked Tabitha, tossing her head a little disdainfully, but less than she might have done if he had not obtained a charter for his discourse by giving her the bracelet. "Fie, Tabitha! I tell you it has not arrived," she said with some anger. "I have not got a lover, and everybody knows I haven't, and it's an insinuating thing for you to say so." Louis laughed, thinking how natural it was that a girl should so emphatically deny circumstances that would not bear curious inquiry. "Why, of course, I meant myself," he said soothingly. "So then, will you not accept me?" "I didn't know you meant yourself," she replied. "But I won't accept you, and I think you ought not to jest on such subjects." "Well, perhaps not. However, don't let the bishop see your bracelet, and all will be well. But mind, lovers are deceivers." Tabitha laughed, and they parted, the girl entering the church. She had been feeling almost certain that, having accidentally found the bracelet somewhere, he had presented it in a whim to her as the first girl he met. Yet now she began to have momentary doubts whether he had not been labouring under a mistake, and had imagined her to be the owner. The bracelet was not valuable. It was, in fact, a mere toy, the pair of which this was one being a little present made to Lady Constantine by Swithin on the day of their marriage, and she had not worn them with sufficient frequency out of doors for Tabitha to recognize either as positively her ladyship's. But when out of sight of the blower the girl momentarily tried it on, in a corner by the organ, it seemed to her that the ornament was possibly Lady Constantine's. Now that the pink beads shone before her eyes on her own arm, she remembered having seen a bracelet with just such an effect gracing the wrist of Lady Constantine upon one occasion. A temporary self-surrender to the sophism that if Mr. Louis Glanville chose to give away anything belonging to his sister, she, Tabitha, had a right to take it without question, was soon checked by a resolve to carry the tempting strings of coral to her ladyship that evening, and inquire the truth about them. This decided on, she slipped the bracelet into her pocket, and played her voluntaries with a light heart. Bishop Helmsdale did not tear himself away from Welland till about 2 o'clock that afternoon, which was 3 hours later than he had intended to leave. It was with a feeling of relief that Swithin, looking from the top of the tower, saw the carriage drive out from the vicarage into the turnpike road, and whirl the right reverend gentleman again towards Warborne. The coast being now clear of him, Swithin meditated how to see Viviette and explain what had happened. With this in view he waited where he was till evening came on. Meanwhile Lady Constantine and her brother dined by themselves at Welland House. They had not met since the morning, and as soon as they were left alone Louis said, "You have done very well so far, but you might have been a little warmer." "Done well?" she asked with surprise. "Yes, with the bishop. The difficult question is how to follow up your advantage. How are you to keep yourself in sight of him?" "Heavens, Louis, you don't seriously mean that the Bishop of Melchester has any feelings for me other than friendly?" "Viviette, this is affectation. You know he has as well as I do." She sighed. "Yes," she said, "I own I had a suspicion of the same thing. What a misfortune!"
A misfortune? Surely the world is turned upside down. You will drive me to despair about our future if you see things so awry. Exert yourself to do something so as to make of this accident a stepping stone to higher things. The gentleman will give us the slip if we don't pursue the friendship at once." "I cannot have you talk like this," she cried impatiently. "I have no more thought of the Bishop than I have of the Pope. I would much rather not have had him here to lunch at all. You said it would be necessary to do it, and an opportunity, and I thought it my duty to show some hospitality when he was coming so near, Mr. Torkingham's house being so small. But of course I understood that the opportunity would be one for you in getting to know him, your prospects being so indefinite at present, not one for me." "If you don't follow up this chance of being spiritual Queen of Melchester, you will never have another of being anything. Mind this, Viviette, you are not so young as you were. You are getting on to be a middle-aged woman, and your black hair is precisely of the sort which time quickly turns grey. You must make up your mind to grizzled bachelors or widowers. Young marriageable men won't look at you, or if they do just now, in a year or two more they'll despise you as an antiquated party." Lady Constantine perceptibly paled. "Young men what?" she asked. "Say that again." "I said that it was no use to think of young men. They won't look at you much longer, or if they do, it will be to look away again very quickly." "You imply that if I were to marry a man younger than myself, he would speedily acquire a contempt for me. How much younger must this man be than his wife, to get that feeling for her?" She was resting her elbow on the chair as she faintly spoke the words, and covered her eyes with her hand. "An exceedingly small number of years," said Louis dryly. "Now the Bishop is at least 15 years older than you, and on that account, no less than on others, is an excellent match. You would be head of the Church in this diocese. What more can you require after these years of miserable obscurity? In addition, you would escape that minor thorn in the flesh of bishops' wives of being only misses, while their husbands are peers." She was not listening. His previous observation still detained her thoughts. "Louis," she said, "in the case of a woman marrying a man much younger than herself, does he get to dislike her, even if there has been a social advantage to him in the union?" "Yes, not a whit less. Ask any person of experience. But what of that? Let's talk of our own affairs. You say you have no thought of the Bishop, and yet, if he had stayed here another day or two, he would have proposed to you straight off." "Seriously, Louis, I could not accept him." "Why not?" "I don't love him." "Oh, I like those words!" cried Louis, throwing himself back in his chair and looking at the ceiling in satirical enjoyment. "A woman who at 22 married for convenience, at 30 talks of not marrying without love. The rule of inverse, that is, in which more requires less, and less requires more. As your only brother, older than yourself and more experienced, I insist that you encourage the Bishop." "Don't quarrel with me, Louis," she said piteously. "We don't know that he thinks anything of me. We only guess." "I know it, and you shall hear how I know. I am of a curious and conjectural nature, as you are aware. Last night, when everybody had gone to bed, I stepped out for a 5 minutes' smoke on the lawn, and walked down to where you get near the vicarage windows. While I was there in the dark, one of them opened, and Bishop Helmsdale leant out. The illuminated oblong of your window shone him full in the face between the trees, and presently your shadow crossed it. He waved his hand and murmured some tender words, though what they were exactly I could not hear." "What a vague imaginary story! As if he could know my shadow! Besides, a man of the Bishop's dignity wouldn't have done such a thing. When I knew him as a younger man, he was not at all romantic, and he's not likely to have grown so now." "That's just what he is likely to have done. No lover is so extreme a specimen of the species as an old lover. Come, Viviette, no more of this fencing. I have entered into the project heart and soul, so much that I have postponed my departure till the matter is well under way." "Louis, my dear Louis, you will bring me into some disagreeable position," she said, clasping her hands. "I do entreat you not to interfere or do anything rash about me. The step is impossible. I have something to tell you some day. I must live on and endure." "Everything except this penury," replied Louis, unmoved. "Come, I have begun the campaign by inviting Bishop Helmsdale, and I'll take the responsibility of carrying it on. All I ask of you is not to make a ninny of yourself. Come, give me your promise." "No, I cannot. I don't know how to.
I only know one thing, that I am in no hurry.'
'No hurry be hanged! Agree like a good sister to charm the Bishop.'
'I must consider,' she replied with perturbed evasiveness. It being a fine evening, Louis went out of the house to enjoy his cigar in the shrubbery. On reaching his favourite seat he found that he had left his cigar case behind him. He immediately returned for it. When he approached the window by which he had emerged, he saw Swithin St. Cleeve standing there in the dusk, talking to Viviette inside. St. Cleeve's back was towards Louis, but whether at a signal from her or by accident, he quickly turned and recognized Glanville. Whereupon, raising his hat to Lady Constantine, the young man passed along the terrace walk and out by the churchyard door. Louis rejoined his sister. 'I didn't know you allowed your lawn to be a public thoroughfare for the parish,' he said. 'I am not exclusive, especially since I have been so poor,' replied she. 'Then do you let everybody pass this way, or only that illustrious youth, because he is so good looking?' 'I have no strict rule in the case. Mr. St. Cleeve is an acquaintance of mine, and he can certainly come here if he chooses.' Her colour rose somewhat, and she spoke warmly. Louis was too cautious a bird to reveal to her what had suddenly dawned upon his mind, that his sister, in common with the, to his thinking, unhappy Tabitha Lark, had been foolish enough to get interested in this phenomenon of the parish, this scientific Adonis. But he resolved to cure her at once of her tender feeling, if it existed, by letting out a secret which would inflame her dignity against the weakness. 'A good-looking young man,' he said, with his eyes where Swithin had vanished. 'But not so good as he looks. In fact, a regular young sinner.' 'What do you mean?' 'Oh, only a little feature I discovered in St. Cleeve's history. But I suppose he has a right to sow his wild oats as well as other young men.' 'Tell me what you allude to, do, Louis.' 'It is hardly fit that I should. However, the case is amusing enough. I was sitting in the arbour today, and was an unwilling listener to the oddest interview I ever heard of. Our friend the Bishop discovered, when we visited the observatory last night, that our astronomer was not alone in his seclusion. A lady shared his romantic den with him, and finding this, the Bishop naturally enough felt that the ordinance of confirmation had been profaned. So his lordship sent for Master Swithin this morning, and meeting him in the churchyard, read him such an excommunicating lecture as I'll warrant he won't forget in his lifetime. Ah, 'twas very good, very.' He watched her face narrowly while he spoke with such seeming carelessness. Instead of the agitation of jealousy that he had expected to be aroused by this hint of another woman in the case, there was a curious expression, more like embarrassment than anything else which might have been fairly attributed to the subject. 'Can it be that I am mistaken?' he asked himself. The possibility that he might be mistaken restored Louis to good humour, and lights having been brought, he sat with his sister for some time, talking with purpose of Swithin's low rank on one side, and the sordid struggles that might be in store for him. St. Cleeve being in the unhappy case of deriving his existence through two channels of society, it resulted that he seemed to belong to neither this nor that, according to the altitude of the beholder. Louis threw the light entirely upon Swithin's agricultural side, bringing out old Mrs. Martin and her connections and her ways of life with luminous distinctness, till Lady Constantine became greatly depressed. She in her hopefulness had almost forgotten latterly that the bucolic element, so incisively represented by Messrs. Hezzy Biles, Hamos Fry, Sammy Blore, and the rest, entered into his condition at all. To her he had been the son of his academic father alone. But she would not reveal the depression to which she had been subjected by this resuscitation of the homely half of poor Swithin, presently putting an end to the subject by walking hither and thither about the room. 'What have you lost?' said Louis, observing her movements. 'Nothing of consequence. A bracelet.' 'Coral?' he inquired calmly. 'Yes. How did you know it was coral? You have never seen it, have you?' He was about to make answer, but the amazed enlightenment which her announcement had produced in him, through knowing where the Bishop had found such an article, led him to reconsider himself. Then, like an astute man, by no means sure of the dimensions of the intrigue he might be uncovering, he said carelessly, 'I found one in the churchyard today, but I thought it appeared to be of no great rarity, and I gave it to one of the village girls who was passing by.' 'Did she take it? Who was she?' said the unsuspecting Viviette. 'Really, I don't remember. I suppose it is of no consequence?' "Oh no, its value is nothing, comparatively. It was only one of a pair such as a young girl wears." Lady Constantine would not add that, in spite of this, she herself valued it as being Swithin's present, and the best he could afford. Panic struck by his ruminations, although revealing nothing by his manner, Louis soon after went up to his room, professedly to write letters. He gave vent to a low whistle when he was out of hearing. He of course remembered perfectly well to whom he had given the corals, and resolved to seek out Tabitha the next morning to ascertain whether she could possibly have owned such a trinket as well as her sister, which at present he very greatly doubted, though fervently hoping that she might. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 29. The effect upon Swithin of the interview with the Bishop had been a very marked one. He felt that he had good ground for resenting that dignitary's tone in haughtily assuming that all must be sinful, which at the first blush appeared to be so, and in narrowly refusing a young man the benefit of a single doubt. Swithin's assurance that he would be able to explain all some day had been taken in contemptuous incredulity. "He may be as virtuous as the prototype Timothy, but he's an opinionated old fogey all the same," said St. Cleeve petulantly. Yet, on the other hand, Swithin's nature was so fresh and ingenuous, notwithstanding that recent affairs had somewhat denaturalized him, that for a man in the Bishop's position to think him immoral was almost as overwhelming as if he had actually been so, and at moments he could scarcely bear existence under so gross a suspicion. What was his union with Lady Constantine worth to him when, by reason of it, he was thought a reprobate by almost the only man who had professed to take an interest in him? Certainly, by contrast with his air-built image of himself as a worthy astronomer, received by all the world, and the envied husband of Viviette, the present imputation was humiliating. The glorious light of this tender and refined passion seemed to have become debased to burlesque hues by pure accident, and his aesthetic, no less than his ethic taste, was offended by such an anticlimax. He who had soared amid the remotest grandeurs of nature had been taken to task on a rudimentary question of morals, which had never been a question with him at all. This was what the exigencies of an awkward attachment had brought him to, but he blamed the circumstances, and not for one moment Lady Constantine. Having now set his heart against a longer concealment, he was disposed to think that an excellent way of beginning a revelation of their marriage could be by writing a confidential letter to the Bishop, detailing the whole case. But it was impossible to do this on his own responsibility. He still recognized the understanding entered into with Viviette before the marriage to be as binding as ever, that the initiative in disclosing their union should come from her. Yet he hardly doubted that she would take that initiative when he told her of his extraordinary reprimand in the churchyard. This was what he had come to do when Louis saw him standing at the window. But before he had said half a dozen words to Viviette, she motioned him to go on, which he mechanically did, ere he could sufficiently collect his thoughts on its advisability or otherwise. He did not, however, go far. While Louis and his sister were discussing him in the drawing-room, he lingered musing in the churchyard, hoping that she might be able to escape and join him in the consultation he so earnestly desired. She at last found an opportunity to do this. As soon as Louis had left the room and shut himself in upstairs, she ran out by the window in the direction Swithin had taken. When her footsteps began crunching on the gravel, he came forward from the churchyard door. They embraced each other in haste, and then, in a few short panting words, she explained to him that her brother had heard and witnessed the interview on that spot between himself and the Bishop, and had told her the substance of the Bishop's accusation, not knowing she was the woman in the cabin. "And what I cannot understand is this," she added. "How did the Bishop discover that the person behind the bed curtains was a woman and not a man?" Swithin explained that the Bishop had found the bracelet on the bed, and had brought it to him in the churchyard. "Oh, Swithin, what do you say? Found the coral bracelet? What did you do with it?" Swithin clasped his hand to his pocket. "Dear me, I recollect I left it where it lay on Reuben Heath's tombstone." "Oh, my dear, dear Swithin!" she cried miserably. You have compromised me by your forgetfulness. I have claimed the article as mine. My brother did not tell me that the bishop brought it from the cabin. What can I do? Can I do? That neither the bishop nor my brother may conclude I was the woman there.
But if we announce our marriage?
Even as your wife, the position was too undignified, too I don't know what, for me ever to admit that I was there. Right or wrong, I must declare the bracelet was not mine. Such an escapade! Why, it would make me ridiculous in the county, and anything rather than that.
I was in hope that you would agree to let our marriage be known, said Swithin with some disappointment. I thought that these circumstances would make the reason for doing so doubly strong.
Yes, but there are, alas, reasons against it still stronger. Let me have my way.
Certainly, dearest. I promised that before you agreed to be mine. My reputation, what is it? Perhaps I shall be dead and forgotten before the next transit of Venus. She soothed him tenderly, but could not tell him why she felt the reasons against any announcement as yet to be stronger than those in favour of it. How could she, when her feeling had been cautiously fed and developed by her brother Louis's unvarnished exhibition of Swithin's material position in the eyes of the world, that of a young man, the son of a family of farmers recently her tenants, living at the homestead with his grandmother, Mrs. Martin. To soften her refusal, she said in declaring it, "One concession, Swithin, I certainly will make. I will see you oftener. I will come to the cabin and tower frequently, and will contrive too that you come to the house occasionally. During the last winter we passed whole weeks without meeting. Don't let us allow that to happen again." "Very well, dearest," said Swithin good humouredly. "I don't care so terribly much for the old man's opinion of me after all. For the present, then, let things be as they are." Nevertheless, the youth felt her refusal more than he owned. But the unequal temperament of Swithin's age, so soon depressed on his own account, was also soon to recover on hers, and it was with almost a child's forgetfulness of the past that he took her view of the case. When he was gone, she hastily re-entered the house. Her brother had not reappeared from upstairs, but she was informed that Tabitha Lark was waiting to see her, if her ladyship would pardon the said Tabitha for coming so late. Lady Constantine made no objection, and saw the young girl at once. When Lady Constantine entered the waiting-room, behold, in Tabitha's outstretched hand lay the coral ornament which had been causing Viviette so much anxiety. "I guessed on second thoughts that it was yours, my lady," said Tabitha, with rather a frightened face, "so I have brought it back." "How did you come by it, Tabitha?" "Mr. Glanville gave it to me. He must have thought it was mine. I took it, fancying at the moment that he handed it to me because I happened to come by first after he had found it." Lady Constantine saw how the situation might be improved, so as to effect her deliverance from this troublesome little web of evidence. "Oh, you can keep it," she said brightly. "It was very good of you to bring it back, but keep it for your very own. Take Mr. Glanville at his word, and don't explain. And Tabitha, divide the strands into 2 bracelets. There are enough of them to make a pair." The next morning, in pursuance of his resolution, Louis wandered round the grounds till he saw the girl of whom he was waiting enter the church. He accosted her over the wall. But, puzzling to view, a coral bracelet blushed on each of her young arms, for she had promptly carried out the suggestion of Lady Constantine. "You are wearing it, I see, Tabitha, with the other," he murmured. "Then you mean to keep it?" "Yes, I mean to keep it." "Are you sure it's not Lady Constantine's? I find she has one like it." "Quite sure. But you had better take it to her, sir, and ask her," said the saucy girl. "No, no, that's not necessary," replied Louis, considerably shaken in his convictions. When Louis met his sister a short time after, he did not catch her, as he had intended to do, by saying suddenly, "I have found your bracelet. I know who has got it." "You cannot have found it," she replied quietly, "for I have discovered that it was never lost," and stretching out both of her hands, she revealed one on each, Viviette having performed the same operation with her remaining bracelet that she had advised Tabitha to do with the other. Louis was mystified, but by no means convinced. In spite of this attempt to hoodwink him, his mind returned to the subject every hour of the day. There was no doubt that either Tabitha or Viviette had been with Swithin in the cabin.
He recapitulated every case that had occurred during his visit to Welland in which his sister's manner had been of a colour to justify the suspicion that it was she. There was that strange incident in the corridor when she had screamed at what she described to be a shadowy resemblance to her late husband. How very improbable that this fancy should have been the only cause of her agitation. Then he noticed, during Swithin's confirmation, a blush upon her cheek when he passed her on his way to the Bishop, and a fervour in her glance during the few moments of the imposition of hands. Then he suddenly recalled the night at the railway station, when the incident with the whip took place, and how, when he reached Welland House an hour later, he had found no Viviette there. Running thus from incident to incident, he increased his suspicions, without being able to cull from the circumstances anything amounting to evidence. But evidence he now determined to acquire without saying a word to anyone. His plan was of a cruel kind, to set a trap into which the pair would blindly walk if any secret understanding existed between them of the nature he suspected. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of 2 on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. 2 on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 30. Louis began his stratagem by calling at the tower one afternoon, as if on the impulse of the moment. After a friendly chat with Swithin, whom he found there having watched him enter, Louis invited the young man to dine the same evening at the house, that he might have an opportunity of showing him some interesting old scientific work in folio, which, according to Louis's account, he had stumbled on in the library. Louis set no great bait for St. Cleeve in this statement, for old science was not old art, which, having perfected itself, has died and left its secret hidden in its remains. But Swithin was a responsive fellow, and readily agreed to come, being, moreover, always glad of a chance of meeting Viviette en famille. He hoped to tell her of a scheme that had lately suggested itself to him as likely to benefit them both. That he should go away for a while, and endeavour to raise sufficient funds to visit the great observatories of Europe, with an eye to a post in one of them. Hitherto the only bar to the plan had been the exceeding narrowness of his income, which, though sufficient for his present life, was absolutely inadequate to the requirements of a travelling astronomer. Meanwhile Louis Glanville had returned to the house, and told his sister in the most innocent manner that he had been in the company of St. Cleeve that afternoon, getting a few wrinkles on astronomy, that they had grown so friendly over the fascinating subject as to leave him no alternative but to invite St. Cleeve to dine at Welland that same evening, with a view to certain researches in the library afterwards. "I could quite make allowances for any youthful errors into which he may have been betrayed," Louis continued sententiously, "since, for a scientist, he is really admirable. No doubt the Bishop's caution will not be lost upon him. And as for his birth and connections, those he can't help." Lady Constantine showed such alacrity in adopting the idea of having Swithin to dinner, and she ignored his youthful errors so completely as almost to betray herself. In fulfilment of her promise to see him oftener, she had been intending to run across to Swithin on that identical evening. Now the trouble would be saved in a very delightful way, by the exercise of a little hospitality which Viviette herself would not have dared to suggest. Dinner time came, and with it Swithin, exhibiting rather a blushing and nervous manner that was, unfortunately, more likely to betray their cause than was Viviette's own more practised bearing. Throughout the meal Louis sat like a spider in the corner of his web, observing them narrowly, and at moments flinging out an artful thread here and there, with a view to their entanglement. But they underwent the ordeal marvellously well. Perhaps the actual tie between them, being so much closer and of so much more practical a nature than even their critics supposed it, was in itself a protection against their exhibiting that ultra reciprocity of manner which, if they had been merely lovers, might have betrayed them. After dinner the trio duly adjourned to the library as had been planned, and the volumes were brought forth by Louis with the zest of a bibliophilist. Swithin had seen most of them before, and thought but little of them, but the pleasure of staying in the house made him welcome any reason for doing so, and he willingly looked over whatever was put before him, from Bertius's Ptolemy to Rees's Cyclopedia. The evening thus passed away, and it began to grow late. Swithin, who among other things had planned to go to Greenwich next day to view the Royal Observatory, would every now and then start up and prepare to leave for home, when Glanville would unearth some other volume, and so detain him yet another half hour. "By George," he said, looking at the clock when Swithin was at last really about to depart, "I didn't know it was so late. Why not stay here tonight, St. Cleeve? It's very dark, and the way to your place is an awkward cross cut over the fields." "It would not inconvenience us at all, Mr. St. Cleeve, if you would care to stay," said Lady Constantine. "I'm afraid the fact is, I wanted to make an observation at 20 minutes past 2, began Swithin. "Oh, now, never mind your observation," said Louis. "That's only an excuse. Do that tomorrow night. Now you will stay. It is settled. Viviette, say he must stay, and we'll have another hour of these charming intellectual researches." Viviette obeyed with delightful ease. "Do stay, Mr. St. Cleeve," she said sweetly. "Well, in truth I can do without the observation," replied the young man, as he gave way. "It is not of the greatest consequence." Thus it was arranged, but the researches among the tomes were not prolonged to the extent that Louis had suggested. In 3/4 of an hour from that time they had all retired to their respective rooms. Lady Constantine's being on one side of the west corridor, Swithin's opposite, and Louis's at the further end. Had a person followed Louis when he withdrew, that watcher would have discovered, on peeping through the keyhole of his door, that he was engaged in one of the oddest of occupations for such a man, sweeping down from the ceiling, by means of a walking cane, a long cobweb which lingered on high in the corner. Keeping it stretched upon the cane, he gently opened the door, and set the candle in such a position on the mat that the light shone down the corridor. Thus guided by its rays, he passed out slipperless, till he reached the door of St. Cleeve's room, where he plied the dangling spider's thread in such a manner that it stretched across like a tightrope from jamb to jamb, barring in its fragile way entrance and egress. The operation completed, he retired again, and extinguishing his light, went through his bedroom window out upon the flat roof of the portico, to which it gave access. Here Louis made himself comfortable in his chair and smoking cap, enjoying the fragrance of a cigar for something like half an hour. His position commanded a view of the 2 windows of Lady Constantine's room, and from these a dim light shone continuously. Having the window partly open at his back, and the door of his room also scarcely closed, his ear retained a fair command of any noises that might be made. In due time faint movements became audible, whereupon, returning to his room, he re-entered the corridor and listened intently. All was silent again, and darkness reigned from end to end. Glanville, however, groped his way along the passage till he again reached Swithin's door, where he examined by the light of a wax match he had brought the condition of the spider's thread. It was gone. Somebody had carried it off bodily, as Samson carried off the pin and the web. In other words, a person had passed through the door. Still holding the faint wax light in his hand, Louis turned to the door of Lady Constantine's chamber, where he observed first that, though it was pushed together so as to appear fastened to cursory view, the door was not really closed by about 1/4 of an inch. He dropped his light and extinguished it with his foot. Listening, he heard a voice within, Viviette's voice, in a subdued murmur, though speaking earnestly. Without any hesitation, Louis then returned to Swithin's door, opened it, and walked in. The starlight from without was sufficient, now that his eyes had become accustomed to the darkness, to reveal that the room was unoccupied, and that nothing therein had been disturbed. With a heavy tread Louis came forth, walked loudly across the corridor, knocked at Lady Constantine's door, and called, "Viviette!" She heard him instantly, replying, "Yes," in startled tones. Immediately afterwards she opened her door, and confronted him in her dressing gown with a light in her hand. "What is the matter, Louis?" she said. "I am greatly alarmed. Our visitor is missing." "Missing? What, Mr. St. Cleeve?"
Yes, I was sitting up to finish a cigar, when I thought I heard a noise in this direction. On coming to his room, I find he is not there."
Good heaven! I wonder what has happened!" she exclaimed in apparently intense alarm.
"I wonder," said Glanville grimly.
"Suppose he is a somnambulist. If so, he may have gone out and broken his neck. I have never heard that he is one, but they say that sleeping in strange places disturbs the mind of people who are given to that sort of thing, and provokes them to it."
"Unfortunately for your theory, his bed has not been touched."
"Oh, what then can it be?"
Her brother looked her full in the face. "Viviette," he said sternly. She seemed puzzled.
"Well?" she replied in simple tones.
"I heard voices in your room," he continued.
"Voices?"
"A voice. Yours."
"Yes, you may have done so. It was mine."
"A listener is required for a speaker."
"True, Louis."
"Well, to whom were you speaking?"
"God."
"Viviette, I am ashamed of you."
"I was saying my prayers."
"Prayers? To God? To Swithin, rather."
"What do you mean, Louis?" she asked, flushing up warm, and drawing back from him. "It was a form of prayer I use, particularly when I am in trouble. It was recommended to me by the Bishop, and Mr. Torkingham commends it very highly."
"On your honour, if you have any," he said bitterly, "whom have you there in your room?"
"No human being."
"Flatly, I don't believe you." She gave a dignified little bow, and waving her hand into the apartment, said,
"Very well. Then search and see."
Louis entered and glanced round the room. Behind the curtains, under the bed, out of the window, a view from which showed that escape thence would have been impossible, everywhere, in short, capable or incapable of affording a retreat to humanity, but discovered nobody. All he observed was that a light stood on the low table by her bedside, that on the bed lay an open prayer book, the counterpane being unpressed, except into a little pit beside the prayer book, apparently where her head had rested in kneeling. "But where is St. Cleeve?" he said, turning in bewilderment from these evidences of innocent devotion.
"Where can he be?" she chimed in with real distress. "I should so much like to know. Look about for him. I am quite uneasy."
"I will, on one condition: that you own that you love him."
"Why should you force me to do that?" she murmured. "It would be no such wonder if I did."
"Come, you do."
"Well, I do."
"Well, now I'll look for him."
Louis took a light and turned away, astonished that she had not indignantly resented his intrusion, and the nature of his questioning. At this moment a slight noise was heard on the staircase, and they could see a figure rising step by step, and coming forward against the long lights of the staircase window. It was Swithin in his ordinary dress, and carrying his boots in his hands. When he beheld them standing there so motionless, he looked rather disconcerted, but came on towards his room. Lady Constantine was too agitated to speak, but Louis said, "I am glad to see you again. Hearing a noise a few minutes ago, I came out to learn what it could be. I found you absent, and we have been very much alarmed." "I am very sorry," said Swithin with contrition. "I owe you 100 apologies, but the truth is that on entering my bedroom I found the sky remarkably clear, and though I told you that the observation I was to make was of no great consequence, on thinking it over alone I felt it ought not to be allowed to pass. So I was tempted to run across to the observatory and make it, as I hoped, without disturbing anybody. If I had known that I should alarm you, I would not have done it for the world." Swithin spoke very earnestly to Louis, and did not observe the tender reproach in Viviette's eyes when he showed by his tale his decided notion that the prime use of dark nights lay in their furtherance of practical astronomy. Everything being now satisfactorily explained, the three retired to their several chambers, and Louis heard no more noises that night, or rather morning, his attempts to solve the mystery of Viviette's life here and her relations to St. Cleeve having thus far resulted chiefly in perplexity. True, an admission had been wrung from her, and even without such an admission it was clear that she had a tender feeling for Swithin. How to extinguish that romantic folly it now became his object to consider. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 31. Swithin's midnight excursion to the tower in the cause of science led him to oversleep himself, and when the brother and sister met at breakfast in the morning he did not appear. "Don't disturb him, don't disturb him," said Louis laconically. "Hello, Viviette. What are you reading there that makes you flame up so?" She was glancing over a letter that she had just opened, and at his words looked up with misgiving. The incident of the previous night left her in great doubt as to what her bearing towards him ought to be. She had made no show of resenting his conduct at the time, from a momentary supposition that he must know her secret, and afterwards, finding that he did not know it, it seemed too late to affect indignation at his suspicions. So she preserved a quiet neutrality. Even had she resolved on an artificial part, she might have forgotten to play it at this instant, the letter being of a kind to banish previous considerations. "It is a letter from Bishop Helmsdale," she faltered. "Well done! I hope for your sake it's an offer." "That's just what it is." "No, surely," said Louis, beginning a laugh of surprise. "Yes," she returned indifferently. "You can read it if you like." "I don't wish to pry into a communication of that sort." "Oh, you may read it," she said, tossing the letter across to him. Louis thereupon read as under: The Palace, Melchester, June 28th, 18 something. My dear Lady Constantine, during the 2 or 3 weeks that have elapsed since I experienced the great pleasure of renewing my acquaintance with you, the varied agitation of my feelings has clearly proved that my only course is to address you by letter, and at once. Whether the subject of my communication be acceptable to you or not, I can at least assure you that to suppress it would be far less natural, and upon the whole less advisable than to speak out frankly, even if afterwards I hold my peace for ever. The great change in my experience during the past year or two, the change, that is, which has resulted from my advancement to a bishopric, has frequently suggested to me of late that a discontinuance in my domestic life of the solitude of past years was a question which ought to be seriously contemplated. But whether I should ever have contemplated it without the great good fortune of my meeting with you is doubtful. However, the thing has been considered at last, and without more ado I candidly ask if you would be willing to give up your life at Welland, and relieve my household loneliness here by becoming my wife. I am far from desiring to force a hurried decision on your part, and will wait your good pleasure patiently, should you feel any uncertainty at the moment as to the step. I am quite disqualified by habits of experience for the delightful procedure of urging my suit in the ardent terms which would be so appropriate towards such a lady, and so expressive of my inmost feelings. In truth, a prosy cleric of 45 wants encouragement to make him eloquent. Of this, however, I can assure you, that if admiration, esteem, and devotion can compensate in any way for the lack of those qualities which might be found to burn with more outward brightness in a younger man, those it is in my power to bestow for the term of my earthly life. Your steady adherence to church principles, and your interest in ecclesiastical polity, as was shown by your bright questioning on those subjects during our morning walk round your grounds, have indicated strongly to me the grace and appropriateness with which you would fill the position of a bishop's wife, and how greatly you would add to his reputation, should you be disposed to honour him with your hand. Formerly there have been times when I was of opinion, and you will rightly appreciate my candour in owning it, that a wife was an impediment to a bishop's due activities. But constant observation has convinced me that, far from this being the truth, a meet consort infuses life into episcopal influence and teaching. Should you reply in the affirmative, I will at once come to see you, and with your permission will, among other things, show you a few plain, practical rules which I have interested myself in drawing up for our future guidance. Should you refuse to change your condition on my account, your decision will, as I need hardly say, be a great blow to me. In any event, I could not do less than I have done, after giving the subject my full consideration. Even if there be a slight deficiency of warmth on your part, my earnest hope is that a mind comprehensive as yours will perceive the immense power of good that you might exercise in the position in which a union with me would place you, and allow that perception to weigh in determining your answer. I remain, my dear Lady Constantine, with the highest respect and affection, yours always, C. Melchester. Well, you will not have the foolhardiness to decline, now that a question has actually been popped, I should hope, said Louis when he had done reading. Certainly I shall, she replied. You will really be such a flat, Viviette? You speak without much compliment. I have not the least idea of accepting him. Surely you will not let your infatuation for that young fellow carry you so far, after my acquainting you with the shady side of his character. You call yourself a religious woman. Say your prayers out loud. Follow up the revived methods in church practice and what not, and yet you can think with partiality of a person who, far from having any religion in him, breaks the most elementary commandments in the Decalogue. I cannot agree with you, she said, turning her face askance, for she knew not how much of her brother's language was sincere, and how much assumed, the extent of his discoveries with regard to her secret ties being a mystery. At moments she was disposed to declare the whole truth, and have done with it, but she hesitated, and left the words unsaid, and Louis continued his breakfast in silence. When he had finished, and she had eaten little or nothing, he asked once more, "How do you intend to answer that letter? Here you are, the poorest woman in the county, abandoned by the people who used to be glad to know you, and leading a life as dismal and dreary as a nun's, when an opportunity is offered you of leaping at once into a leading position in this part of England. Bishops are given to hospitality. You would be welcomed everywhere. In short, your answer must be yes." "Yet it shall be no," she said in a low voice, and at length learnt, from the tone of her brother's latter remarks, that at any rate he had no knowledge of her actual marriage, whatever indirect ties he might suspect her guilty of. Louis could restrain himself no longer at her answer. "Then conduct your affairs your own way. I know you to be leading a life that won't bear investigation, and I am hanged if I'll stay here any longer." Saying which, Glanville jerked back his chair and strode out of the room. In less than a quarter of an hour, and before she had moved a step from the table, she heard him leaving the house. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 32. What to do she could not tell. The step which Swithin had entreated her to take, objectionable and premature as it had seemed in a county aspect, would at all events have saved her from this dilemma. Had she allowed him to tell the bishop his simple story in its fullness, who could say but that that divine might have generously bridled his own impulses, entered into the case with sympathy, and forwarded with zest the designs for the future, owing to his interest of old in Swithin's father, and in the naturally attractive features of the young man's career. A puff of wind from the open window, wafting the bishop's letter to the floor, aroused her from her reverie. With a sigh she stooped and picked it up, glanced at it again, then arose, and with the deliberateness of inevitable action wrote her reply. Welland House, June 29th, 18 something. My dear Bishop of Melchester, I confess to you that your letter, so gracious and flattering as it is, has taken your friend somewhat unawares. The least I can do in return for its contents is to reply as quickly as possible. There is no one in the world who esteemed your high qualities more than myself, or who has greater faith in your ability to adorn the episcopal seat that you have been called on to fill. But to your question I can give only one reply, and that is an unqualified negative. To state this unavoidable decision distresses me without affectation, and I trust you will believe that, though I decline the distinction of becoming your wife, I shall never cease to interest myself in all that pertains to you and your office, and shall feel the keenest regret if this refusal should operate to prevent a lifelong friendship between us. I am, my dear Bishop of Melchester, ever sincerely yours, Viviette Constantine. A sudden revulsion from the subterfuge of writing as if she were still a widow wrought in her mind a feeling of dissatisfaction with the whole scheme of concealment, and pushing aside the letter she allowed it to remain unfolded and unaddressed. In a few minutes she heard Swithin approaching, when she put the letter out of the way and turned to receive him. Swithin entered quietly and looked round the room. Seeing with unexpected pleasure that she was there alone, he came over and kissed her. Her discomposure at some foregone event was soon obvious. "Has my staying caused you any trouble?" he asked in a whisper. "Where is your brother this morning?" She smiled through her perplexity as she took his hand. "The oddest thing has happened to me, dear Swithin," she said. "Do you particularly wish to know what has happened now?" "Yes, if you don't mind telling me." "I do mind telling you, but I must. Among other things, I am resolving to give way to your representations, in part at least. It will be best to tell the Bishop everything, and my brother, if not other people." "I am truly glad to hear it, Viviette," he said cheerfully. "I have felt for a long time that honesty is the best policy." "I at any rate feel it now. But it is a policy that requires a great deal of courage." "It certainly requires some courage. I should not say a great deal. And, indeed, as far as I am concerned, it demands less courage to speak out than to hold my tongue." "But, you silly boy, you don't know what has happened. The Bishop has made me an offer of marriage." "Good gracious, what an impertinent old man! What have you done about it, dearest?" "Well, I have hardly accepted him," she replied, laughing. "It is this event which has suggested to me that I should make my refusal a reason for confiding our situation to him." "What would you have done if you had not been already appropriated?" "Oh, that's an inscrutable mystery. He is a worthy man, but he has very pronounced views about his own position, and some other undesirable qualities. Still, who knows? You must bless your stars that you have secured me. Now let us consider how to draw up our confession to him. I wish I had listened to you first, and allowed you to take him into our confidence before his declaration arrived. He may possibly resent the concealment now. However, this cannot be helped." "I'll tell you what, Viviette," said Swithin after a thoughtful pause. "If the Bishop is such an earthly sort of man as this, a man who goes falling in love, wanting to marry you, and so on, I'm not disposed to confess anything to him at all. I fancied him altogether different from that." "Oh, but he's none the worse for it, dear." "I think he is, to lecture me and love you all in one breath. Still, that's only a passing phase, and you first proposed making a confidant of him." "I did. Well, very well. Then are we to tell nobody but the Bishop?" "And my brother Louis. I must tell him. It is unavoidable. He suspects me in a way that I could never have credited him." Swithin, as was before stated, had arranged to start for Greenwich that morning, permission having been accorded him by the Astronomer Royal to view the observatory; and their final decision was that, as he could not afford time to sit down with her, and write to the Bishop in collaboration, each should, during the day, compose a well considered letter, disclosing their position from his and her own point of view, Lady Constantine leading up to her confession by her refusal of the Bishop's hand. It was necessary that she should know what Swithin had contemplated saying, that their statements might precisely harmonize. He ultimately agreed to send her his letter by the next morning's post, when, having read it, she would in due course dispatch it with her own. As soon as she had breakfasted, Swithin went his way, promising to return from Greenwich by the end of the week. Viviette passed the remainder of that long summer day, during which her young husband was receding towards the capital in an almost motionless state. At some instants she felt exultant at the idea of announcing her marriage and defying general opinion. At another her heart misgave her, and she was tormented by a fear lest Swithin should some day accuse her of having hampered his deliberately shaped plan of life by her intrusive romanticism. That was often the trick of men who had sealed by marriage, in their inexperienced youth, a love for those whom their maturer judgment would have rejected as too obviously disproportionate in years. However, it was now too late for these lugubrious thoughts, and bracing herself, she began to frame the new reply to Bishop Helmsdale, the plain unvarnished tale that was to supplant the undivulging answer first written. She was engaged on this difficult problem till daylight faded in the west, and the broad-faced moon edged upwards like a plate of old gold over the elms towards the village. By that time Swithin had reached Greenwich. Her brother had gone she knew not whither, and she and loneliness dwelt solely, as before, within the walls of Welland House. At this hour of sunset and moonrise the new parlour-maid entered to inform her that Mr. Cecil's head clerk from Warborne particularly wished to see her. Mr. Cecil was her solicitor, and she knew of nothing whatever that required his intervention just at present. But he would not have sent at this time of day without excellent reasons, and she directed that the young man might be shown in where she was. On his entry, the first thing she noticed was that in his hand he carried a newspaper. "In case you should have not seen this evening's paper, Lady Constantine, Mr. Cecil has directed me to bring it to you at once, on account of what appears there in relation to your ladyship. He has only just seen it himself." "What is it? How does it concern me?" "I will point it out." "Read it yourself to me, though I am afraid there is not enough light." "I can see very well here," said the lawyer's clerk, stepping to the window. Folding back the paper, he read: "News from South Africa. Cape Town, May 17th, via Plymouth. A correspondent of the Cape Chronicle states that he has interviewed an Englishman just arrived from the interior, and learns from him that a considerable misapprehension exists in England concerning the death of the traveller and hunter Sir Blount Constantine." "Oh, he is living! My husband is alive!" she cried, sinking down in nearly a fainting condition. "No, my lady, Sir Blount is dead enough, I am sorry to say." "Dead, did you say?" "Certainly, Lady Constantine. There is no doubt of it." She sat up, and her intense relief almost made itself perceptible, like a fresh atmosphere in the room. "Yes. What did you come for?" she asked calmly. "That Sir Blount has died is unquestionable," replied the lawyer's clerk gently. "But there has been some mistake about the date of his death." "He died of malarious fever on the banks of the Zuga, October 24th, 18 something." "No. He only lay ill there a long time, it seems. It was a companion who died at that date. But I'll read the account to your ladyship with your permission. The decease of this somewhat eccentric wanderer did not occur at the time hitherto supposed, but only in last December. The following is the account of the Englishman alluded to, given as nearly as possible in his own words. During the illness of Sir Blount and his friend by the Zuga, 3 of the servants went away, taking with them a portion of his clothing and effects, and it must be they who spread the report of his death at this time. After his companion's death he mended, and when he was strong enough he and I travelled on to a healthier district. I urged him not to delay his return to England, but he was much against going back there again, and became so rough in his manner towards me that we parted company at the first opportunity I could find. I joined a party of white traders returning to the west coast. I stayed here among the Portuguese for many months. I then found that an English travelling party were going to explore a district adjoining that which I formerly traversed with Sir Blount. They said they would be glad of my services, and I joined them. When we had crossed the territory to the south of Ulanda, and drew near to Marzambo, I heard tidings of a man living there whom I suspected to be Sir Blount, although he was not known by that name. Being so near, I was induced to seek him out, and found that he was indeed the same. He had dropped his old name altogether, and had married a native princess. "Married a native princess?" said Lady Constantine. "That's what it says, my lady. Married a native princess according to the rights of the tribe, and was living very happily with her. He told me he should never return to England again. He also told me that, having seen this princess just after I had left him, he had been attracted by her, and had thereupon decided to reside with her in that country, as being a land which afforded him greater happiness than he could hope to attain elsewhere. He asked me to stay with him, instead of going on with the party, and not to reveal his real title to any of them. After some hesitation I did stay, and was not uncomfortable at first. But I soon found that Sir Blount drank much harder now than when I had known him, and that he was at times very greatly depressed in mind at his position. One morning in the middle of December last I heard a shot from his dwelling. His wife rushed frantically past me as I hastened to the spot, and when I entered I found that he had put an end to himself with his revolver. His princess was broken-hearted all that day. When we had buried him,
I discovered in his house a little box directed to his solicitors at Warborne, in England, and a note from myself, saying that I had better get the first chance of returning that offered, and requesting me to take the box with me. It is supposed to contain papers and articles for friends in England who have deemed him dead for some time. The clerk stopped his reading, and there was silence. "The middle of last December," she said at length in a whisper. "Has the box arrived yet?" "Not yet, my lady. We have no further proof of anything. As soon as the package comes to hand, you shall know of it immediately." Such was the clerk's mission, and leaving the paper with her, he withdrew. The intelligence amounted to thus much: that Sir Blount having been alive till at least 6 weeks after her marriage with Swithin St. Cleeve, Swithin St. Cleeve was not her husband in the eye of the law; that she would have to consider how her marriage with the latter might be instantly repeated, to establish herself legally as that young man's wife. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Two on a Tower. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 33. Next morning Viviette received a visit from Mr. Cecil himself. He informed her that the box spoken of by the servant had arrived quite unexpectedly just after the departure of his clerk on the previous evening. There had not been sufficient time for him to thoroughly examine it as yet, but he had seen enough to enable him to state that it contained letters, dated memoranda in Sir Blount's handwriting, notes referring to events which had happened later than his supposed death, and other irrefragable proofs that the account in the newspapers was correct as to the main fact, the comparatively recent date of Sir Blount's decease. She looked up and spoke with the irresponsible helplessness of a child. "On reviewing the circumstances, I cannot think how I could have allowed myself to believe the first tidings," she said. "Everybody else believed them, and why should you not have done so?" said the lawyer. "How came the will to be permitted to be proved, as there could, after all, have been no complete evidence?" she asked. "If I had been the executrix, I would not have attempted it. As I was not, I know very little about how the business was pushed through. In a very unseemly way, I think." "Well, no," said Mr. Cecil, feeling himself morally called upon to defend legal procedure from such imputations. "It was done in the usual way in all cases where the proof of death is only presumptive. The evidence, such as it was laid before the court by the applicants, your husband's cousins, and the servants who had been with him deposed to his death with a particularity that was deemed sufficient. Their error was, not that somebody died, for somebody did die at the time affirmed, but that they mistook one person for another, the person who died being not Sir Blount Constantine. The court was of the opinion that the evidence led up to a reasonable inference that the deceased was actually Sir Blount, and probate was granted on the strength of it. As there was a doubt about the exact day of the month, the applicants were allowed to swear that he died on or after the date last given of his existence, which, in spite of their error then, has really come true now, of course. "They little think what they have done to me by being so ready to swear," she murmured. Mr. Cecil, supposing her to allude only to the pecuniary straits in which he had been prematurely placed by the will taking effect a year before its due time, said, "True, it has been to your ladyship's loss and to their gain, but they will make ample restitution, no doubt, and all will be wound up satisfactorily." Lady Constantine was far from explaining that this was not her meaning, and after some further conversation of a purely technical nature, Mr. Cecil left her presence. When she was again unencumbered with the necessity of exhibiting a proper bearing, the sense that she had greatly suffered in pocket by the undue haste of the executors weighed upon her mind with a pressure quite inappreciable, beside the greater gravity of her personal position. What was her position as legatee to her situation as a woman? Her face crimsoned with a flush which she was almost ashamed to show to the daylight, as she hastily penned the following note to Swithin at Greenwich, certainly one of the most informal documents she had ever written. Welland, Thursday. "Oh, Swithin, my dear Swithin, what I have to tell you is so sad and so humiliating that I can hardly write it, and yet I must.
Though we are dearer to each other than all the world besides, and as firmly united as if we were one, I am not legally your wife. Sir Blount did not die till some time after we in England supposed. The service must be repeated instantly. I have not been able to sleep all night. I feel so frightened and ashamed that I can scarcely arrange my thoughts. The newspaper sent with this will explain, if you have not seen the particulars. Do come to me as soon as you can, that we may consult on what to do. Burn this at once. Your Viviette. When the note was dispatched, she remembered that there was another, hardly less important question to be answered, the proposal of the Bishop for her hand. His communication had sunk into nothingness beside the momentous news that had so greatly distressed her. The two replies lay before her. The one she had first written, simply declining to become Dr. Helmsdale's wife, without giving reasons. The second, which she had elaborated with so much care on the previous day, relating in confidential detail the history of her love for Swithin, their secret marriage, and their hopes for the future, asking his advice on what their procedure should be to escape the strictures of a censorious world. It was a letter she had barely finished writing when Mr. Cecil's clerk announced news tantamount to a declaration that she was no wife at all. This epistle she now destroyed, and with the less reluctance in knowing that Swithin had been somewhat averse to the confession as soon as he found that Bishop Helmsdale was also a victim to tender sentiment concerning her. The first, in which at the time of writing the suppressio veri was too strong for her conscience, had now become an honest letter, and sadly folding it, she sent the missive on its way. The sense of her undefinable position kept her from much repose on the second night also, but the following morning brought an unexpected letter from Swithin, written about the same hour as hers to him, and it comforted her much. He had seen the account in the newspapers almost as soon as it had come to her knowledge, and sent this line to reassure her in the perturbation she must naturally feel. She was not to be alarmed at all. They two were husband and wife in moral intent and antecedent belief, and the legal flaw which accident had so curiously uncovered could be mended in half an hour. He would return on Saturday night at latest, but as the hour would probably be far advanced, he would ask her to meet him by slipping out of the house to the tower any time during service on Sunday morning, when there would be few persons about likely to observe them. Meanwhile he might provisionally state that their best course in the emergency would be, instead of confessing to anybody that there had already been a solemnization of marriage between them, to arrange their remarriage in as open a manner as possible, as if it were the just reached climax of a sudden affection, instead of harking back to an old departure, prefacing it by a public announcement in the usual way. This plan of approaching their second union with all the show and circumstance of a new thing recommended itself to her strongly, but for one objection, that by such a course the wedding could not, without appearing like an act of unseemly haste, take place so quickly as she desired for her own moral satisfaction. It might take place somewhat early, say in the course of a month or two, without bringing down upon her the charge of levity, for Sir Blount, a notoriously unkind husband, had been out of her sight 4 years, and in his grave nearly 1. But what she naturally desired was that there should be no more delay than was positively necessary for obtaining a new licence, 2 or 3 days at longest, and in view of this celerity it was next to impossible to make due preparation for a wedding of ordinary publicity, performed in her own church from her own house, with a feast and amusements for the villagers, a tea for the school children, a bonfire, and other of those proclamatory accessories which, by meeting wonder half-way, deprive it of much of its intensity. It must be admitted, too, that she even now shrank from the shock of surprise that would inevitably be caused by her openly taking for husband such a mere youth of no position as Swithin still appeared, notwithstanding that in years he was by this time within a trifle of 21. The straightforward course had, nevertheless, so much to recommend it, so well avoided the disadvantage of future revelation which a private repetition of the ceremony would entail, that assuming she could depend upon Swithin, as she knew she could do, good sense counselled its serious consideration. She became more composed at her queer situation. Hour after hour passed, and the first spasmodic impulse of womanly decorum, not to let the sun go down upon her present improper state, was quite controllable. She could regard the strange contingency that had arisen with something like philosophy. The day slipped by. She thought of the awkwardness of the accident rather than of its humiliation, and loving Swithin now in a far calmer spirit than at that past date when they had rushed into each other's arms and vowed to be one for the first time, she ever and anon caught herself reflecting, were it not that for my honour's sake I must remarry him, I should perhaps be a nobler woman in not allowing him to encumber his bright future by a union with me at all. This thought, at first artificially raised, as little more than a mental exercise, became by stages a genuine conviction, and while her heart enforced, her reason regretted the necessity of abstaining from self-sacrifice, the being obliged, despite his curious escape from the first attempt, to lime Swithin's young wings again solely for her credit's sake. However, the deed had to be done. Swithin was to be made legally hers. Selfishness in a conjecture of this sort was excusable, and even obligatory. Taking brighter views, she hoped that upon the whole this yoking of the young fellow with her, a portionless woman and his senior, would not greatly endanger his career. In such a mood night overtook her, and she went to bed conjecturing that Swithin had by this time arrived in the parish, was perhaps even at that moment passing homeward beneath her walls, that in less than 12 hours she would have met him, have ventilated the secret which oppressed her, and have satisfactorily arranged with him the details of their reunion. End of chapter 33.